Few individuals in modern history evoke as much horror as the Austrian painter, the man who led Germany to its most catastrophic period. Industrialized oppression, ideological warfare, the scale and systematization of the atrocities perpetrated under his regime, the mechanized brutality, all supported by the totalitarian state apparatus. All of this has compelled scholars across several disciplines to interrogate not only his actions, but the architecture of his mind. Among the earliest to assess Hitler's personality was Carl Jung, who, having observed him in the 1930s, characterized him as inhuman, emotionally vacuous, devoid of humor, subsumed by a mystical vision of Germany's imperial rebirth. Jung notably contrasted him with Mussolini, whom, despite also being a ferocious dictator, he regarded as comprehensible, projecting human spontaneity. Subsequent efforts to delineate Hitler's psychological makeup have frequently drawn upon retrospective diagnostic frameworks, including instruments modeled after the Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. These studies seek to examine how psychopathological variables may intersect with political ideology, personal trauma, and the acquisition of totalitarian power. The present analysis synthesizes findings from various posthumous assessments, integrating psychoanalytic, cognitive, and personality-based paradigms to articulate a psychological profile. A prominent line of inquiry posits that Hitler manifested symptoms of multiple severe psychopathologies, chief among them paranoid schizophrenia and narcissistic personality disorder. Rather than pathologizing post facto for rhetorical effect, this study aims to discern how individual psychopathology may serve as a vector for mass violence when scaffolded by power and mythic ideology. It is crucial to emphasize that the invocation of clinical terminology is not an exercise in any form of justification. As historian Ron Rosenbaum has underscored, the analytical impulse must be carefully balanced to avoid inadvertently rendering atrocity as mere dysfunction. However, clinical insight, when wielded judiciously, can clarify the psychological mechanism by which extreme violence is both rationalized, enacted, and sustained. The Second World War is often ranked as one of the most consequential historical events of the past millennium. Likewise, Hitler could be considered as one of the most influential figures of that specific period in Europe, 20th century. So, what does this sort of empirical consensus underscore? It underlined the unparalleled significance of unchecked psychological disorders within the minds of people with power. We can clearly all agree that if there is anything that we can do to avoid history from repeating, then the subject should be studied thoroughly. But generally speaking, when we look at this from a historical point of view, we look at the economic conditions that were one of the reasons why, specifically in Germany in that period, an extreme ideology such as National Socialism would connect with the people. And looking at the historical context is definitely one of the pieces of the puzzle, a key of sorts. Now, we have already covered that several times on this channel, but for today, I want to focus on his mind. Are there elements of similitude with a certain pattern of predictability that can be recognized within the mind of the monster? While it may be tempting intellectually and morally to relegate Hitler to the realm of the purely evil, cognitive theorist Aaron T. Beck cautioned that such categorizations, while emotionally satisfying, obscure the psychological patterns necessary for comprehension. In his examination of the Nazi regime, Beck argued that the simplistic label of evil inhibits meaningful psychological analysis and understanding of the antecedent cognitive structures. One of the most systematic attempts to construct a clinical profile was conducted using the Coolidge Axis II inventory, a diagnostic tool designed to evaluate a broad spectrum of personality and neurocognitive disorders. This assessment uniquely involved 5 historians, each deeply familiar with Hitler's life, who served as expert informants. Despite inherent limitation of retrospective diagnosis, the concordance across these raters was remarkably high. The findings suggested significant elevation, specifically when it comes to post-traumatic stress disorder, psychotic ideation, and traits associated with schizophrenia. On the personality axis, marked elevations were observed in paranoid, narcissistic, antisocial, and sadistic dimensions. As one of the bases for the preparation of this video, I found a study called the 1943 OSS Psychological Profile by Dr. Walter Langer. and according to this study, a pivotal moment in Hitler's psychological trajectory occurred in 1918, following exposure to mustard gas and his subsequent hospitalization in spacewalk. Hitler described this episode in Mein Kampf as a transformative spiritual awakening in which the humiliation of Germany's surrender eclipsed his personal sufferings. This moment, he claimed, crystallized his mission in life, framing it as, open quotes, political conquest and national rebirth, close quotes. Lange hypothesizes that this vision may have been either psychogenic or hallucinatory in nature, potentially symptomatic of an emergent psychotic disorder. Later analyses have proposed a variety of interpretations, ranging from hysterical blindness to a delusional psychotic break. Henry Murray's independent OSS report mirrored these conclusions, framing Hitler's personality as a grandiose yet brittle construct, forged in the crucible of trauma, shame, and unrelenting rage. Murray also identifies as a repertoire of traits. Among these, paranoia, delusional omnipotence, intense envy, and a self-ascribed messianic identity. In other words, we are in the presence of virtually every diagnostic hallmark associated with severe psychopathology. An enduring paradox emerges from these profiles. How did an individual so evidently unstable attain and maintain such profound political influence? Murray contended that by 1943, Hitler had not yet succumbed entirely to psychosis, though his mental stability was visibly eroding. He observed recurrent neurotic episodes, increasing indecisiveness, and a psychic deterioration that correlated with Germany's strategic failures. Notably, Murray predicted Hitler would choose to end his own life over surrender, a forecast realized in 1945. The rationale was existential. Hitler's identity was so inextricably bound to the myth of the Reich that its collapse rendered continued existence psychologically untenable. But I think what really is the most striking element of this phenomenon is that Hitler's delusions were not merely endured, they were operationalized. He harnessed his paranoia, reshaped it into a political tool, and galvanized the anxieties of the collective, the quintessential combination of opportunity, charisma, and nefarious ends. The psychoanalytic thinker Erich Fromm offered one of the most penetrating critiques of Hitler's inner life, classifying him as a, open quotes, necrophilous character, close quotes, emotionally attuned not to vitality, generativity, but to death and destruction. Fromm's framework painted Hitler as a pathological narcissist, devoid of empathy and sustained by a compulsive attraction to annihilation. The way Fromm attributes this is still in line with what we've been talking about so far, but still slightly different. He does talk about the individual's predisposition in combination with the developmental trauma, but also underlines the influence of an authoritarian father, together with suffocating maternal attention. He theorized that Hitler's idealization of the German folk reflected an unconscious transfer of unresolved Oedipal longing, while his virulent antisemitism functioned as a projection of patricidal rage redirected towards a symbolic external enemy. To complete our superficial diagnostic portrait, we have to underline that, as we mentioned, paranoid type schizophrenia, we have to underline that it is several clinical theorists that converge towards that diagnosis. Do remember that we have several recordings of his speeches and writing, and as you examine these, you will find persecutory delusions, megalomania, and profound cognitive distortion. Alongside this, exploitative cruelty, compulsive need for dominance, sadistic personality, relentless grandiosity, hypersensitivity to criticism, and pathological need for recognition align squarely with narcissistic pathology. Furthermore, the obsessive nature of his anti-Semitic ideation, imbued with themes of contamination and existential threat, suggests a paranoid personality disorder and persistent interpersonal suspicion. A characteristic in fact in common with Stalin. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Having discussed all of this, let's talk briefly about some of the counter-arguments against this hypothesis. We just said that Hitler was most likely schizophrenic, among other things. However, schizophrenia typically compromises functional capacity. However, historical parallels with figures like Jim Jones or Charles Manson reveal that psychotic leaders can nonetheless exhibit extraordinary organizational control within ideological cults. In fact, these studies note that individuals with paranoid schizophrenia may remain behaviorally intact within highly structured environments, such as, for instance, authoritarian regimes, such as cults, as we said, but also authoritarian regimes. And Coolidge evaluation revealed Hitler's schizophrenia score to be nearly 2 standard deviation above the mean, corroborated by his psychotic thinking, as it appears in his writings. Even his PTSD score, elevated even beyond Axis 1, suggests the enduring psychic impact of his wartime experiences. In other words, I think we can easily say that from the point of view of Hitler and the people that were involved in it, National Socialism was not just a regime, it was a cult. Hence, the cult-like mentality and methodology. As we get closer to the fall, and therefore the end of his life, signs of at least mild executive dysfunction, indecision, cognitive rigidity, and most importantly impaired judgment began to be evident. All of this paired with his erratic leadership, strategic paralysis, and Hitler's profound introversion, a trait uniformly agreed by upon all clinical theorists. And through the lenses of his sociopathy, Hitler saw other people, including German people, as instruments, tools for the realization of the expression of his sick mind. At the end of this cursory analysis and profiling, the evaluation offers a chilling composite. Hitler is far from just being an inscrutable embodiment of evil. His mind emerges instead as a dysfunctional prism of the ideological fixation of the self, the result of which, a catastrophe of historical proportion.